Well, thanks for that, Dan, and thanks, Mick, for that summary of the black-fronted tern, which, as Dan said, I dipped on the day, trying to get onto it. Drove up from Sydney instead of going to Maroubra, where I normally sea watch from. We decided to try our luck in the Hunter and didn't have any. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting record, and as to why that bird turned up and how it did, I don't think we'll ever know. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully it's still around somewhere and can be picked up. But the fact that it wasn't relocated to me kind of suggests that it might not have been in with white-fronted terns, just because you would have thought it would have been seen with them subsequently. Yeah, I mean, a peregrine could have got it. Who knows? So yeah, my name's Simon Gorta. I'm a research assistant at the University of New South Wales. And I'm going to talk to you all today about seabirds at sea off New South Wales, particularly using citizen science or just birdwatching data to inform sort of conservation goals and really working out what's going on with seabirds at sea off our state. So briefly, a little bit about me. As Dan said, I've been birding around the Mile Lakes, Hawk's Nest area for a long time. My grandma had a house up there, so yeah, many times a year we'd go up there and holiday, and I still spend as much time as I can up there, but I'm based in Sydney. And yeah, I've spent a lot of time volunteering, working on regent honeyeaters and swift parrots a bit. Been out to Cabbage Tree Island, working on the Gould's petrels. And I've also been birding in Australia and been lucky enough to go overseas, chasing birds and mammals as well, which has been great. So from 2016 to 2018, I did my undergraduate at UNSW in ecology. And in 2019, I did my honours. And yeah, currently I'm a research assistant in the Centre for Ecosystem Science at UNSW. And that picture's at Seal Rocks for the keen-eyed among you. So yeah, my research career is currently short. I've only just really begun. So in 2019, my honours was completed out in Sturt National Park. And I was looking at how birds were affected by drought. But I've sort of spread myself fairly wide in terms of what I've done so far. So I've worked on some plants, carnivorous mammals and birds in Australia, and also some sort of anecdotal studies in India and Southern Africa as well. And I'm currently working on a bunch of stuff to do with water management in the Murray-Darling Basin as well. But primarily I'm interested in seabirds, particularly in the Tasman, which is what I'll be talking to you about. So I sit in a sort of interesting position in terms of researching seabirds in that I'm a birder, but I'm also an ecologist. So from a research perspective, seabirds are very interesting because they're globally distributed. So lessons you learn from one species or one individual that's widely, or one species that's widely distributed across the world can be applicable globally. They've got a whole range of ecological functions. They're predators at sea, on islands. They perform quite an interesting fertilizing role through guano. Scavengers, and through making burrows, they can, on islands, which those of you who've been on seabird islands will know can be quite treacherous, that can pull water and promote plant growth and that sort of thing. So they can really be sort of ecosystem engineers on islands. They've also got quite extreme physiologies to enable them to be able to survive for, in some cases, multiple years at sea. It's quite a specialized environment that they exist in. And sadly, also around a third of all seabird species are threatened with extinction globally. So all in all, from a research perspective, seabirds can be considered as indicators of ecosystem health, both on islands where they breed and at sea where they feed and all the rest of it. But from a birding perspective, it's quite different. So birds, seabirds are quite diverse. They've got a range of different forms, and they can also be challenging to ID and quite rare. So that makes them quite an interesting and challenging group of birds for birders, for listers, for both, to really sort of get into. And they're also an excuse to visit some fairly far-flung places like Macquarie Island and other sub-Antarctic islands, and even just going out to some of the other breeding islands that they're on, or just going out in storms to the coast to watch them is most people probably wouldn't do that if not for seabirds. And yeah, I guess that fuels a kind of mad pelagic birding obsession that's certainly taken over me, and I suspect Mick would also own up to that, and probably a few others here. So yeah, I like to, in my research, to capitalize on that obsession, because if there's one thing that's great about having all these obsessed bird watchers with seabirds, it's that they're really focused on how to identify them, on counting them, and going out as much as possible to see them. So from a research perspective, that's great, because you end up with a really comprehensive data set that's been gone over arguably more thoroughly than a lot of researchers would go over IDs of individuals. So yeah, I like to capitalize on that. And just for an example, I've got 2 wandering type albatrosses below, and you can see that they are very similar in appearance. There's an older male Gibson's albatross on the left, and a younger male, I think it's a male, I'm not sure, wandering albatross. That wandering albatross is actually banded in on one of the South African islands. And yeah, they look, I'd say, almost identical, but they are in fact different species. And the mad birders pictures up on the right are the ones who put in a lot of effort to ID them. Some of the other another way of observing seabirds, aside from going out on boats, is also observing them by land. And I do this a lot at Maroubra. And I know quite a few people here do it out of Newcastle, sometimes with not as much luck as we have down at Maroubra. But it turns out I didn't have any photos of us at Maroubra, so I put a picture up of some of the guys down at in WA who sea watch from a dune in pretty wild weather. Yeah.
Simon, is that where they sea watch? Is it?
Yeah.
WA? Really? That's the spot.
They use the dune and the vegetation as shelter.
Wow.
Which is, yeah, it's all very different depending on where you sea watch from. Yeah, but I think they get pretty wet.
I reckon.
Yeah. So yeah, the bulk of this talk is about some research that was done published in 2019, but was about 2 years of work. And it was a big collaborative effort between some researchers and pelagic birders, the guys who coordinate the pelagic trips out of Port Stephens, Sydney, and Wollongong and Kiama. And that includes Mick and Dan. So starting around summer 2017, 2018, I began to collate all the pelagic bird records from January 2000 until December 2016. So off Port Stephens, there were 7 years of data from 2010 to 2016. And from Sydney and Wollongong, there was the full 17-year data set. So in total, that was 385 trips, which covered 86 different species that have been recorded. And of those 86, 30 were seen 25 or more times, which meant that I was able to able to analyze them statistically to work out a few things that were going on with them long-term, seasonally, and so on. So before I get into the methods and what we found, I've just got a bit of background on what the oceanography is like off New South Wales, because I think that's critical to understand in terms of how seabirds may respond to their to various factors in the environment that they live in at sea. So the predominant feature is the East Australian current off the eastern seaboard of Australia. And that's a warm, nutrient poor current that runs south from the Coral Sea. But it varies a bit, but from around Port Stephens up to around Smoky Cape, it diverts east and eventually sort of runs over the top of New Zealand. And so that's about 70% of the current's energy diverts over that way, and a remaining 30% continues south. And that, when it continues south, tends to turn into a field of eddies that was coined Eddy Avenue. And that is effectively, just a whole lot of swirling. I guess it's like cyclones and anticyclones in the water. So some rotate clockwise, some rotate anti-clockwise. And that in itself has a whole lot of different features involved, which we didn't look into. So with that feature off New South Wales, we tend to see the effect of eddies and around Sydney and Kiama and Port Stephens. We can get a bit more of the East Australian current itself actually pushing through, but again, it's often eddies as well that will have an impact, at least the edges of them. And so in terms of productivity, which is essentially a way of measuring, I guess, food availability for seabirds, the East Australian current and the resulting eddies can drive some, the eddies can drive some upwelling, and you can also get upwelling from wind around the Tasman front divergence, but also at the continental shelf is probably the most reliable area where upwelling can occur. And upwelling is essentially where cool water and nutrients are brought up from the deeper ocean to the surface, which enables, I guess, a feeding event to occur. So in this study, had three main goals. The first of which was to determine potential environmental drivers of seabird abundances off New South Wales. The second was to just look at the long-term trends in abundance of the common seabirds that we found. And then finally, it was to look at how those trends compared to trends at breeding colonies. So is what we're seeing at sea off New South Wales replicated in the breeding colonies of these birds, the islands which they breed on, which can be on the other side of the world pretty much. And it can also be fairly local. So the way we did this was by creating 10 by 10 kilometer, I guess, quadrats, from which we got some environmental data and average it across that broader area. And that was to essentially account for a bit of variation in where the trips went. But roughly they went from whichever port the boat was going out of to somewhere over the continental shelf in an east to southeast direction, usually. Occasionally there are exceptions, and but that was quite rare. And so we looked at so seasonality and time were that obviously you don't measure those using that quadrat. That's just they're just temporal variables. But using these quadrats, we did look at sea surface temperature. So what was the temperature of the ocean? And the way we did that was looking at the anomaly of sea surface temperature. So was it above or below average, and by how much? We also looked at chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A is a measurement that can be made from using satellites to look at ocean color, which is a way of measuring phytoplankton. And that's a crude but the best available way of measuring productivity. So the more chlorophyll there is, the more phytoplankton there is, and theoretically, the more zooplankton and potentially fish to feed seabirds. We also looked at eddy kinetic energy, which is just a measure of current strength, basically. And then also wind speed, which was determined from the nearest area on land. So in Sydney, it was, I've forgotten which, it might have been North Head that we used, and off Port Stephens, I've forgotten which one it was, but yeah, it would have been Nelson Bay, I suspect. So in terms of what we found, 29 of the 30 species that we were able to look at varied significantly in seasonal abundance, which isn't too surprising in terms of what birders have observed. You know, we see different types of seabirds in different numbers at different times of years fairly consistently. So the strongest seasonal signals were for the short-tailed shearwater and Wilson's storm petrel. Both of those are migratory species, and short-tailed shearwater particularly has quite a spectacular migration that most of you will have probably either seen the birds live or seen them dead when they've washed up in the springtime. And white-faced storm petrel actually showed no seasonal variation in abundance, which was quite interesting. But when we looked at it in terms of whether it was present or not at different times of year, we found a peak around August, and that reduced slightly through the summer, and it really dropped off in sort of April, May. So I'd argue that it's still quite seasonal. Next, we looked at the long-term changes in abundance over time, and the strongest long-term signals were for wandering albatross and Cape petrel, but 22 of the species we looked at did show a significant change in abundance over that period. And yeah, you can see Cape petrel, it's really just sort of, it was steady until the mid to late 2000s, and it's just declined pretty steadily from then. And wandering albatross has showed sort of a pretty impressive increase, but then around 2010 reached its maximum, and it's dropped off as dramatically as it increased, which actually correlates pretty well to what's happened on the breeding islands as well. So in terms of sea surface temperature anomaly, the way we looked at this was whether seabirds had a positive or a negative association with sea surface temperature anomaly. So if a bird had a positive association, it showed an association with warmer than average sea surface temperatures, and negative was cooler than average sea surface temperature. So kind of like a preference for warmer water or cooler water, whether it was positive or negative respectively. So 10 of the 30 species that we looked at showed a significant association with this variable, 5 positively and 5 negatively. The strongest positive association was sooty tern, so they seem to really like warmer than average water when they do occur, which is also in summer. And also in summer is the long-tailed Jaeger, which showed quite a strong preference for cooler water, which has quite interesting climate change implications, which I'll get onto a bit later. So next we had the chlorophyll, so the productivity, which is the sort of crude measurement of response to, I guess, available food. So only 4 of the 30 species seem to show an association with chlorophyll. The rest just didn't show any sort of significant pattern with this variable. And all of those were positively associated. So when there was more chlorophyll in the water, there were more of these birds. So that was the white-faced storm petrel, Australasian gannet, wandering albatross, and wedge-tailed shearwater. in order of their the strength of those associations. So next we've got the eddy strength or current strength. So only 2 species seem to show a pattern here. And that was the fluttering shearwater, which showed a pretty strong positive association. So that was basically when currents were stronger, there were more fluttering shearwaters. And Wilson's storm petrel showed a negative association here. And so when the currents were stronger, there were less Wilson storm petrels. And finally, one that I can definitely say is observable in the field is that when we've got stronger wind, we tend to get more of quite a few species. So of the 30 species, 10 showed an association with wind strength. 8 of those were positive and 2 negative. So the strongest positive association, meaning that when there's more wind, there's more birds, was with the Gould's petrel. And that's, I think, definitely something that we see at sea on pelagics. Whenever you go out on a trip and the wind gets up in summer, it's always a good shout that a Gould's or a similar type of petrel might show up. And interestingly, the strongest negative association was with the Cape petrel. So when the winds were stronger, there were less capes, or when there was less wind, there were more capes, which is quite interesting, and one that I've not seen enough Cape petrels off New South Wales to really say, sadly, if I've noticed that trend or not. So the next thing we did was group those species using a statistical method to basically group them by the way that they responded to those environmental variables, as well as the temporal variables. So the idea of this was that if you can group birds by the way they respond to their environment and are responding over time, it might be quite easy to conserve potentially a whole group of species if you're able to act on, I guess, resolving some of the issues that might be driving the variables that are affecting their decline, for example. And the result of this was that there were 8 different groups, or we called them archetypes in the study, which had 2 to 5 constituent species, and 4 other groups had just 1 species. So they didn't really count in the further analysis that we did. So the key result was that the grouping of these, the strongest variable that groups these species together was seasonality. And that's consistent with what we showed before, with 29 of the 30 species showing a seasonal signal. So that essentially says that our seabirds, the community that we see off New South Wales, is most strongly driven by season. What you're going to see when you go out in summer is going to be different from what you go out in winter. And what you're going to see at any time when you go out is going to be most likely driven by season. Next, the environmental variables had an effect. And then the long-term abundance was less of a consistent theme among these different birds. And yeah, unsurprisingly, summer and winter groups were associated with positive and negative sea surface temperature, respectively. So in summer, you've got warmer water, and the birds that are there in summer have a preference for warmer water. It's quite straightforward, but it's good when you pick up these trends, because it gives you confidence that what the work that you're doing is showing patterns that you know should be there. So this next bit is about the implications of what we found in terms of climate change. So this wasn't a climate change study, it was just looking at how birds responded to their environmental, to their environments, essentially. But one of the sort of key things here is that you can use these responses to look at what's happening under climate change in the Tasman Sea and start to predict how some of these birds might be affected by the changes in the environment under climate change. So under climate change, the Tasman Sea is actually warming at about 4 times the background rate of ocean warming. So it's either the fastest or one of the fastest warming seas in the world. So yeah, sea surface temperature is increasing under climate change. That's resulting in a drop in productivity, which can be measured through chlorophyll A. And also the East Australian current is strengthening, which is what's driving the sea surface temperature increase as more warm water is pulled down from the Coral Sea. So all of those factors are in part measured in this study. And so we were able to say, well, if some of these species are responding to these variables that are consistent with climate change, what does that say about how they're going to deal with these changes? So one of the summer groups that we looked at, or that came out in that grouping analysis that we did, was included the 3 Jaeger species and the Buller's shearwater. So all of those are present in summer in our waters. They all showed a decline in abundance and were associated with cooler than average water temperatures. So essentially, if these birds prefer cooler than average water in summer, and we're seeing the ocean warming, particularly in summer, that's probably not looking good for this group of birds under climate change. And yeah, there's more work that needs to be done on the other groups to really look at how they're being affected by climate change, or how they will be in future. So this figure is probably quite a lot, but essentially the highlighted birds are the ones that we should be looking at. So these are species that are potentially susceptible to declines under climate change. So if you look at the sea surface temperature anomaly figure, the chlorophyll figure, and the EKE, or eddy kinetic energy figure, so if you can see my mouse, these 3, I've highlighted the birds, which are abbreviated here and spelled out here, that showed responses that would be consistent with a potential susceptibility to changes associated with climate change. So black-browed albatross here shows a preference for cooler than average, so negative from 0, sea surface temperature. So does Hutton shearwater, long-tailed Jaeger, Pomeranian Jaeger, and shy albatross. So these species all seem to prefer cooler than average temperatures of water, but under climate change, we're going to see that water warming. So they may be susceptible under climate change to a decline. Next, we've got chlorophyll. And so we can see that the Australasian gannet, wandering albatross, white-faced storm petrel, and wedge-tailed shearwater all showed a preference for more chlorophyll A in the water. And under climate change, we're going to see that reducing. So again, in terms of productivity, these species may be susceptible. And finally, with eddy kinetic energy, the Wilson storm petrel showed a negative association with current strength. So when there was more current strength, there were less Wilson storm petrels. So again, under climate change, the East Australian current strengthening, and so that may have a negative effect on the Wilson storm petrels. So next, I've flipped that interpretation, and so now we're looking at species that may be able to show some tolerance to climate change, well, to the variables that are going to change under climate change. So species that had a preference for warmer than average temperatures, for example, the flesh-footed shearwater, sooty tern, wandering albatross, white-faced storm petrel, and wedge-tailed shearwater. These seem to show a preference for warmer than average sea surface temperature, so perhaps they may be a bit more tolerant to those warming conditions. Next, we've got chlorophyll. And yeah, there's nothing here that seemed to prefer less chlorophyll in the water. And then with eddy kinetic energy, the fluttering shearwater, which I've actually forgotten to highlight here, showed a positive association with eddy kinetic energy, meaning that there were more when there were stronger currents. So potentially that may play into their response to strengthening currents under climate change. So next, a bit of a sidetrack, but there's also the possibility that some species from which have more tropical ranges will shift into the Tasman Sea as it effectively becomes more tropical as it warms and becomes less productive, which is a typical feature of tropical oceans. And so one of these examples is potentially the Bulwer's petrel. So this is a globally distributed bird all around the tropical and subtropical oceans. And there's a few, like they're regularly seen in, well, they're probably regularly seen in the Northern Coral Sea. When surveys have gone out to sort of the productive areas of the Coral Sea, they've found them in fairly large numbers, but there's not enough surveys to be sure this is consistent, but it probably is. And off northwest WA and just Northern Australia in general, they're pretty regularly seen when the trips do go out. So until 2020, they'd never been seen in the Tasman Sea off Australia. There was one record in 2001 of a beach-washed record, a beach-washed bird in New Zealand. But then all of a sudden in between January and March 2020, 5 of these birds turned up. Some were juveniles, some were adults, some were seen at sea, some turned up, as you can see, on land. And yeah, so there's potential here that these birds might be moving south. The appearance of these birds between January and March wasn't associated with any really big cyclones that could have brought them down or something like that. So it's quite possible these birds may be foraging further and further south as the habitat becomes more suitable for them. But we'll see as time goes on if that is occurring. So finally, I've got the long-term trends. So what's happening broadly in the long term over that 17-year periods for 22 of those species that we were able to get long-term trends for. So overall, 5 species increased over this period. 4 were either too variable to really tell what was going on or were more or less stable. And yeah, 13 decreased, which is the majority, obviously. And so an example of one of these decreases, which is quite stark, is the Pomerania, which is the figure pictured here. And you can see that out of Port Stephens, Sydney, and Wollongong, their numbers have just, yeah, plummeted over that period, which is quite interesting because the Jaegers, we don't specifically know where our birds come from. They presumably come from sort of East Russia or that sort of area, but we don't know. And so we don't actually have a way of monitoring the local populations to our area at their breeding colonies, because they migrate from the Northern Hemisphere where they breed to the Southern Hemisphere, and they spend their summer here before going back up in our winter. So yeah, knowing what's happening at the breeding colonies, it's a bit hard to really tell without just looking at the broad sort of global trend. But definitely in our oceans, in the Tasman Sea off New South Wales, they've declined quite substantially. So I thought I'd start with the bad news. So these are all the species that seem to be decreasing. So that's the Australasian gannet, fluttering shearwater, wedge-tailed shearwater, grey-faced petrel, southern giant petrel, sooty tern, Pomeranian jaeger, wandering albatross, Antipodean albatross, Arctic jaeger, flesh-footed shearwater, fairy prion, and Indian yellow-nosed albatross. A lot of you who go on pelagics would probably have noticed declines in at least a lot of these species, if not all of them. Yeah, that's bad news. In terms of the stable and variable ones, the Providence petrel, Hutton shearwater, Wilson storm petrel, and sooty shearwater seem to have essentially been fairly stable throughout the 17-year period of analysis. And the ones that are increasing include 3 species of albatross, the bullers, black-browed and shy albatrosses, and also the northern giant petrel and white-faced storm petrel. So we then looked at how those long-term trends linked to the breeding trends. So we just used the IUCN red list, which gives an indication of population trends. And for species that we could get more information on more local populations, which our birds were likely to be from, we got expert advice there. Broadly, there was pretty poor agreement between what the trends that we found and the breeding colony trends. But interestingly, the ones that there was agreement for were pretty much all the albatross, except Campbell albatross. But Campbell albatross did actually show agreement there. It's just that the increase wasn't statistically significant in our analysis. There just weren't enough records to be sure. Potentially now, if I redid that analysis, we might see a significant pattern come out. But yeah, effectively, the albatross seem to be pretty consistent between what we can see off New South Wales and what's happening at the breeding colonies, as well as the northern giant petrel. But I guess the biggest conclusion here is that to draw is that declines in our region don't necessarily mean a decline in the seabirds, that species overall. It doesn't necessarily replicate a population decline. It may represent a range shift, or it may represent a decline in the local populations that we weren't able to get that specific data for. And we just had to use the trends across the multiple populations that the IUCN red list applied. Yeah. So I guess the key points are that seasonality drives the trends at sea of our seabird communities, alongside environmental and some long-term temporal factors. Sea surface temperature broadly defined what we see in winter and summer. So in summer, we get species that have a preference for warmer than average, or just warmer water. And in winter, we get species that have a preference for cooler water. Long-term declines have occurred in 43% of the common seabirds in our region. So these may be real population declines, or they might be due to range shifts. And yeah, the effects of climate change are still unclear on our seabirds, but there's some evidence of range shifts. For example, in the Bulwer's petrel, that's a possible example there. And there's some evidence that the communities may be changing. Those Jaegers and the Bulwer's shearwater might be an indication that those declines are linked to climate change. And so we'll be seeing less of them in the community. And many species are potentially susceptible to these changes. But the good side is that we've been able to work out that using citizen science data, or just birdwatching observations, that from birders going out on pelagics regularly, scrutinizing the ID of every bird they see, it's just so valuable for monitoring seabirds at sea, because seabirds communities at sea aren't otherwise monitored. Individuals get trackers put on them sometimes, but looking at communities at sea, it's just not done. So this is really valuable to be able to know what's happening at sea, and potentially in response to climate change. It's great to be able to have this information available. So I guess to everyone who goes out on pelagics, keep doing it, and yeah, thanks for going out in the past. So yeah, a bit of what's next for me. I'm planning on starting a PhD in mid next year, COVID pending. It's going to look something like the at-sea drivers of seabird communities and populations, but I might refine that a bit more as I work out exactly what I'm doing. So I'll definitely be using more of this pelagic bird watching data and looking at potentially a kind of latitudinal study using data from southeast Queensland all the way down to Eaglehawk Neck, and looking at changes that are happening across that latitudinal gradient to infer in a bit more detail how climate change might be affecting these birds. And yeah, also the plan is to have a really tough time on Lord Howe Island, looking at seabird, at sooty tern breeding. Sooty terns are an interesting bird because the CSIRO have listed them as highly at risk from climate change due to declines in productivity around Lord Howe Island, where they breed. And yeah, they've never been tracked before, so I'm hoping to put some trackers on. Well, sorry, they've been tracked before in the Indian Ocean once and in the Caribbean once, but never in the Pacific or in Australia generally. So I'm hoping to put trackers on them and see where they forage when they're breeding and where they go when they're not breeding, because we just don't really know. Although from sea watchers, we do get the impression that at least some of them come east, but that's only during, come west, come to the coast of New South Wales, but particularly that's during big storms. So whether they do that normally or not, it's not clear, we just don't know. And there's also some pre-existing data on their breeding success, which I'd sort of look at 20 years subsequent and sort of see how that's changed. And I've also put in a grant to try get some sea time on the CSIRO research vessel, the RV Investigator, to look at some of the seamount ecosystems that run sort of north to south, a fair way east of the coast, up to sort of 300 nautical miles east. But some of them are within the 200 nautical mile Australian EEZ. And so look at how seabirds as well as other pelagic organisms essentially function at these structures. So yeah, I guess that's it, and keen for questions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Simon. That was fascinating. And I mean, you know, you're preaching to the converted with me and Mick, so you know we're just lapping it up. But I hope that a lot of people at home that are not fanatical seabirders of them, maybe, I don't know, sort of get a bit of a taste for what they're about. And yeah, I hope they've taken away.
I hope so too.
Any questions? Yeah, I've got to keep an eye on chat. I can't see any questions on chat at the moment. So if people want to either do that hand waving function and we'll spot you, or you can just unmute. Everyone's muted, so you can just unmute and shout out if you have a question.
I'll just make a quick comment about what Tom just put in the chat. Like Tom just said that what Simon has done with the data is amazing. And it is, because this is data that otherwise just sits in spreadsheets on people's computers. It's actually, yeah, it's amazing that somebody has actually taken this at sea data, because traditionally all the seabird knowledge we have that's been published has been from islands and colonies. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Just out of interest, it was great that someone could actually put that to use. You know, I knew we should be doing it for one reason or another. I didn't know what that reason was, but yeah, it was easy to just hand over to Simon and let him run with it. Okay, with that stuff. I thought we had a hand wave. It's just like this. Anne. Oh, you're clapping. Oh, Anne's clapping, not waving. Oh, Mick's got a couple of questions to go. If people don't have any questions, we'll check. We've got two screens. We've got a lot of attendees, which is good, despite Origin night flashing again. But it is a dead rubber. No questions. Mick, you can ask the question.
I'm just wondering, Simon, like you are referring to 17 years as long term, which isn't really long term, but I'm wondering if you could tap into some other at-sea data that has been running for a bit longer than these pelagics, perhaps some of the earlier Wollongong trips, just to sort of top up the data set there.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I'm intending to look into. The Newcastle data, for example, before the Port Stephens data that we used, that does exist, and I did have access to that. It just wasn't anywhere near as complete as we needed. It was just a bit patchy in terms of when they went out. So it was good data, but just once a year wasn't gonna, or like 3 times a year maximum kind of thing, like it, that sort of thing.
They were very tied to particular months from memory, aren't they?
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at it.
Which answers Alan's question about Swansea data. The Swansea data, I think Alan has been only like concentrated on 2 or 3 months of the year.
Yeah, and that's the same when Phil was running it. There were trips throughout the year very heavily to those more productive months since you've been running the Port Stephens.
It's just months.
Kind of just been a monthly thing, like the Wollongong.
I can't remember when we went out. We just went out lots of times, but I don't know the months.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was quite a bias towards the October, which you can understand because it's more productive.
Yeah, the reason we picked 2000 to start with was largely because that's when the data became a bit more complete across the year. Certainly some years there were only 7 trips that went out, but still, like that was, I think 7 was about the minimum, 6 or 7 that went out, and then off Wollongong some years they did sort of 14, 15 trips in a year.
But don't those trips, like there was several Swansea trips, 20 or so years ago, and we did some out of Newcastle as well. Aren't they also giving you extra months of data for extra months, and those months would be analysable?
Yeah, they would, but it wouldn't be so, it would be a bit patchy in terms of looking at a long-term trend. If we just wanted to look at months, that could well be used, and as a subsequent study would, like, you could definitely use that data. That data is not unusable by any means. It's just in terms of what we were after, it wasn't, it didn't quite fit the purpose. But in terms of what could be done, there's definitely opportunity to use that. And yeah, longer term data is always going to be valuable. Yeah.
I know that our counts weren't probably as reliable as they now are. They're kind of pretty guessy.
I I think pelagic counts, they're consistent within themselves. I think that's the key. If you wanted to actually say exactly how many birds were present on any trip, it takes one trip off Eaglehawk to be surrounded by potentially thousands of albatross, and how do you count that? You just estimate it relatively, which is, I think, done by most people on pelagics. But again, it's consistent within what the observers normally do. Yeah.
And
You need to unmute, yeah.
Simon, thanks for that. Can you just explain a bit more about, I didn't take it all in, the nutrient thing, the chlorophyll measurement that you had, about how you just explain that whole concept a bit more, please.
So the reason that we included chlorophyll was to get a bit of a measurement of how much food might be available to seabirds. So it was essentially to look at how seabirds might respond to food availability. Ideally, with birds like albatross, which will feed mostly on squid and fish, and you really want to be looking much higher up the food chain. But having data for squid and fish abundance or biomass just doesn't exist at the regularity that these trips were going out. It's basically entirely from trawlers or scientific survey for some of these things. So we used chlorophyll because that was that was available for the whole period. Chlorophyll is it's a pigment that exists in all plants. And
it exists in what? Sorry.
In most plants, if not all.
Yeah.
It's just that green, the green pigment, and so that you can pick that up from space when you get enough of it. So that can be that's measured using satellites. The color, the intensity of the green is measured, and you can estimate chlorophyll. Well, the biomass of the phytoplankton, which are essentially planktonic plants that exist on the sea surface, and that phytoplankton is essentially the base of the pelagic food chain. So zooplankton, which are the small animals, the larval fish, and baby rock lobsters, all of those things, they all exist out in a pelagic form before they go into estuaries or wherever they go to grow up into juveniles and then adults. And they all feed on phytoplankton when they're small. So chlorophyll was used to basically look at the available. It was a crude estimate of the available food, essentially, because it's the base of the food chain, and it's the most readily measurable for all of the trips that we went out on. There's some work being done to measure zooplankton, which is a step up in the food chain. Storm petrels and prions will feed directly on zooplankton. All the filter feeders, Cape petrels too. And so those, that would potentially be more accurate, but it doesn't yet exist, that measure of zooplankton. And, ideally we'd be looking at abundances of all the fish and the squid and or the forage fish, the small enough things that all those birds would directly eat to get a really accurate comparison. But essentially chlorophyll was a compromise at what's available and potentially still indicative. So that's what we went with.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. That's much clearer now.
No worries.
Simon, we just had a request in the chat for the title of the paper, the research. Are you able to put a link or something in?
Yeah, sure.
Then people can grab that if they so wish.
Yeah, it's technically not publicly available, but I don't really like the scientific publishing process. So I've got it all freely available on ResearchGate, and you can also email me specifically, but I'll post the link to ResearchGate in the chat, and I'll send it through to you too, so that you can forward it through the HBOC email list and so on.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Simon. That's much appreciated. I'll just check the wall of people. Michael. Hang about. Where are we? This one. Yeah. So Michael posted in the chat that the point that most pelagic trip reports include max counts at one time, as well as the estimated totals.
Yep.
And that the max count should be more reliable than the estimated totals. I mean, how did you use both of those indicators, or just one of them?
Yeah, we used the estimates because obviously for some things your max counts are going to be bang on, but on days where you've got a lot of birds, if you just use the max count, you're probably going to miss the real abundance.
Yeah. Something like migrating to the shearwaters that might be going in flocks of 5 to 10, but you've had hundreds of them. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which Simon, I know I should know the answer to this, but did you include birds that weren't at the shelf? And so I've got Pomeranian Jaeger in mind.
Yeah.
Because most Pomeranian Jaegers we encounter are within a couple of kilometres, or 5 kilometres anyway, of the heads. So that may not show up in data for lists that are only at the continental shelf.
Yeah, so we used all birds recorded outside the heads.
Okay. Yep.
Not all of those obviously fitted into that 10 by 10 kilometre grid. So that's an obvious issue there with the design. But I would counter that by saying that the majority of birds we see do sit outside of that inshore area. And we've got half of that inshore area included in that 10 by 10 kilometer sort of area anyway. So we're only looking at we're missing the first little period, often when chumming isn't happening as well, I've got to say, which probably controls for a bit of that too. So yeah.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, just one variable that I know that I've chatted to you about is the impact of cloud cover.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you could use rainfall as a surrogate for that, like if it's mapped or
you could use cloud cover.
Great. Well, because I mean, I just my experience, and you know, this is purely anecdotal, is that on really clear sunny days, we tend to see less seabirds than we do on overcast days.
Yep.
And I see a similar thing in woodlands. So, you know, woodland birds will forage all day long if there's cloud cover, but if there's bright sunshine, it limits the activity. So yeah, just wondering if that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that could be looked at, and the data set that Alan was talking about, including that earlier data in a study like that would be fine, because you're just looking at, if you just wanted to look at how birds respond to cloud cover, you get satellite imagery goes back easily 20 years, if not more, and you'd be able to just get cloud cover. Usually when you're using satellite data, you try and do the opposite, because you're looking at what's happening below the clouds, and so you filter out all the cloud cover. But in terms of this, it'd be pretty easy to get an estimate of cloud cover.
Wow. Okay. I think it'd be worth doing.
Yeah, for sure. I'll look into it.
Cool.
Just one more question. Did you look at the really ancient data from like when Sydney boat trips started, way back? Alan Rogers was leading them, and Tim Kenny.
No.
In the 1970s, I guess.
Yeah. So there is some really old stuff, and there's off Wollongong, there's some really old stuff too, as in, well, by really old, I mean, 70s, 80s. There is actually one paper that was published, I think it was using data from the 1981 to 86 or something in that period, where they used, I think it was Wollongong pelagic data, just in that period. And that was the only other study we could find that ever touched this sort of data. But yeah, in this study that I talked about, and so far in my work, I've not looked at the much older stuff. Though I would be particularly interested in looking at it. Maybe not the pelagic stuff so much as the stuff at Malabar, where there used to be a whole lot of poo that floated on the surface, and that would attract hundreds to thousands of wanderers and giant petrels and so on. And yeah, that'd be really great to look at some of the banding data. They used to band birds there by just taking a tinny out and catching the just, the birds were right there next to the rocks. Sea watching off Maroubra isn't like that anymore, and I'm sure if I went down another K to where that photo that I think Mick has somewhere of all those birds just around Malabar, if I went down there, I just wouldn't see anything there now. All the poo's gone. Yeah.
And the abattoir had an outlet.
Yeah. There is still, I suspect there's still some effect of that in terms of about 3 Ks southeast of Magic Point, where we sea watch, we regularly see birds accumulating. And I know that the outlet is still there at about 80 meters deep, but fats and oils should float. So presumably everything that comes out of there that is a fat or an oil would float to the surface, and that may still be resulting in some sort of attraction for those birds. And I'm sure Mick would like to blame our success at Maroubra on that.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be underestimated the impact that these outfalls had, because they showed through the banding that wandering albatross that were nesting on South Georgia actually came back to the Wollongong, Sydney area. I know there's the cuttlefish theory, but also I'm sure that, I mean, all you need to do is look at those photos. The birds knew there was a free feed and they traveled that distance to come to us. Yeah.
I guess one gap in the cuttlefish theory, which is that giant cuttlefish die off at a particular time of year. I think it's in late spring, post-breeding. They float to the surface and they attract albatross. But one of the issues with that is that those cuttlefish are distributed all across the Great Southern Reef. So they're from, you know, a bit north of Sydney all the way around the south of Australia to southwest WA. So why would albatrosses pick out Sydney as opposed to any of those areas?
Yeah,
yeah,
it's the abattoir.
Yeah.
Are you surprised that Port Stephens doesn't get a bigger range of birds being right at the tip of that current? Like, I don't know, I would have thought that would have some influence on the birds that we get. I think the sea surface temperature is a bigger factor.
Yep.
To the south of us, the diversity is, I think, driven more by sea surface temperature.
Yeah, we call it imaginary divides in Newcastle, Sydney.
Yeah.
There seems to be a step
South
up.
of which,
Certainly in those cooler water winter species, seems to be a point.
I'm losing a fair bit of this conversation, not hearing Dan.
Sorry, that's probably because I'm not close enough to the laptop. Yeah, that we often speculate that there's kind of an imaginary boundary somewhere between Newcastle and Sydney, where sort of some of those cooler water species that we get in the winter don't seem to like coming further north. Yeah,
I mean, we've never had blue petrel, any royals, graybacks. So there's a number of birds that, yeah, I think the line is roughly around, you know, sort of from the Hawkesbury out to the ocean.
Yeah.
South of which there seems to be a cool water or cold water influence. North of which that we just don't get those birds. But I'm just surprised that, like, strategically, you'd think that being right at the southern tip of that current, which is almost Seal Rocks, Port Stephens, that we don't have some influence. Like, maybe the eddies are just further offshore. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the eddies are usually a bit further offshore than just the shelf. In terms of the influence, I'd say you definitely do see an influence, which is that that Tasman front, to me, kind of is a bit of a barrier. It seems to stop birds like Tahiti petrel and Kermadec petrel really breaking through. You know, they're pretty, I suspect they're pretty regular off like Southwest Rocks and clearly Southport. They get them all the time. But you rarely get them further, you rarely get them off Port Stephens, and even rarer still further south. So I'd say that's probably the biggest influence of that Tasman front. Being further north, the East Australian current might be a bit stronger as well, which means that you've just got warmer temperatures, and that doesn't die off as quickly as it does a bit further south. But I don't know, I'm speculating here. Yeah.
Okay. Unless anyone else has any more burning questions, I think we might be done. Oh, you got any more? Or are you? Okay. Yes. Winging its way. Is it already in the mail or is it waiting? It'll be in the mail. Mark will be sorting it out. Yeah, there'll be an HBOC mug / chintzy fragile china teacup winging its way to your doorstep.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
So enjoy that one when it arrives. But then, yeah, again, thank you very much, Simon, for taking time out to educate us all on the seabirds that we get in our New South Wales waters. Very, very informative and interesting talk, mate. So
no worries. You're welcome. Happy to talk seabirds.
Okay.